I think about what it would take and how I communicate Chattanooga and how do I communicate that to people that I'm trying to convince to move here or to start a business. And so that means really being able to articulate our story really well. And our story comes from what I'm talking about today, which is our urban identity. Leon Carrier, an urban planner and an architect, said that a city is not an accident, but the result of a coherent vision and aim. I know my city planner friends, and those that are in this room and those aren't, would like that to be true, but is the intention of a few planners, leaders, and even an entire generation of those that live in a community, is that enough to make up an urban identity? Do they get to shape that on their own? Or is it some sort of random chance? Is it the collection of people and ideas kind of smashed together? Can anyone take a stab at what these lights might reveal and what they might obscure?
They reveal the direction that people are moving within the city, but they don't actually say very much about those people. I mean, there's certain implications if they're moving from, say, New Jersey into Manhattan. You can make certain assumptions about their socioeconomic status, their race, even their gender, but there's nothing that actually proves those assumptions either way.
Where are places that you would kind of see these landscapes and you kind of see these lights in the city?
The middle one exactly as North Shore on one side, Tennessee River in the middle.
I agree.
And then the Riverfront Parkway right there. I 100% have seen that on bike rides and stuff, but during the daytime, of course. But I imagine that would be what it looks like at night, that big empty void.
Yeah. This one on the far right is the view from Missionary Ridge.
On the brow of Signal Mountain, and if you look to your right, you see this, you see what looks like downtown, but if you look just a little bit to the left, you see where this square is, that like there looks like a bridge, reminding me of like where the Walmart shopping center is, and then Signal Mountain Boulevard, and then like that little bit of area where Red Bank is, but then perfectly to the right is downtown.
For the middle one, I saw more of the part that's closest to us, or the lower part, looks more industrial. So I'd say that more as Nicola Highway, lots of industry, not much happening in terms of like actual people living there and doing things there. Whereas the other side looks more inhabited, more North Shore-esque, where people actually live and have their lives and culture.
It's interesting when you're talking about cities and framing what counts as the city and what doesn't. What do you tell people when you're talking about your city and what never gets included?
And you know, the thing you mentioned right at the beginning about, or someone mentioned about the fact this is an aerial view, and that who gets to see an aerial view like that, and who does not get to see it. One of the things that is distinctive about Chattanooga that I can assure you is not the situation in Manhattan is the close proximity of mountains right near the densely populated area of the city. And the perspective one gets from being at Lookout Mountain or other Signal Mountain of the city is very special, and it's not common at all. It's an extremely powerful proximity of vantage points. That is, in theory, available to anyone. You don't need to be, extremely affluent to rent a private plane to have a view of the city from that perspective.
But even though Chattanooga has proximity to mountains, that I would ideally let anyone see these views. Look at who lives on those mountains, and you're still going to see a class divide in terms of who's looking at who's seeing an aerial view and who's just down in it. So I think that a part of our Chattanooga's urban identity still is that kind of class divide in terms of who can see an aerial view.
And mentioning like Nicola, one of them looked like Nicola Highway. That instead of saying it looks like Nicola Highway in East Chattanooga, it's looking north. It's always looking at North Chattanooga and downtown, and that I think in our discussions a minute ago, it's about the downtown and that who we talk about, who we see as part of that conversation, and who comes to mind is I think really reflected in what we just said about these if they were Chattanooga.
When we think of what our city is, we think of it as where we play, where we go. So those are the areas that stand out to you. You're looking for those things that you know. So for instance, in the last picture, I could almost say that big light blob that's in the north center portion of it could be Hamilton Place Mall. And then we're looking at Gun Barrel, looking at the lights come down of it. It's where you go and how you perceive the space around you. So, but I do think someone brought up a great point that we have the luxury here in Chattanooga of, with the topography, it's very accessible for people of all ages and all incomes and all areas to be able to get a different perspective from an aerial view.
Assuming this is a night aerial view, if you had one of Chattanooga, in my mind, you'd actually miss out on a significant part of Chattanooga's identity, the positive part, which is the being outdoors, and that like you don't see the green, but in my mind, that is a huge draw of this city.
We've sort of been casually referring to like cultural identity and like urban identity as if it's something that we sort of understand in like the ether, but we don't really think about too much about what goes into it. But collective identity is sort of that definition of that proverbial we. So it's important, both urban identity and we, its importance and complexities are to overstate. But we often take it for granted. We've said that a couple of times here. We take these views for granted, or we take how a city is laid out for granted. But communities form around we. Societies can sometimes discriminate around who's not included in we. We've committed some pretty horrifying acts based off of what isn't we as humans. So from foreign policy all the way to who makes our Christmas card list, like we is an incredibly important concept. And so that's kind of what gets into the idea of a cultural identity. If this were created for Chattanooga, and we've talked a little bit about this, what particular parts of the story would it reveal? But also what would it obscure? So would we see sort of this dichotomy between valley and mountain? Sort of a classic story and narrative in Chattanooga. Would we see these darker areas as a river or parts of the city that we ignore and don't want to talk about?
I don't think the word identity is the right one, it's identities. Even in our assessment of what is in front of us, I think our discussion about who gets to see this view has not been particularly expansive. And I mean that to say that folks who see this view in Chattanooga, that's not inclusive. I mean, there are access to the mountains, folks who grow up in an environment where going up the mountain is the norm. I don't think they are a part of it. They have not been a part of our discussion. So in terms of Chattanooga's identity and how it's kind of growing, we talk about going to Signal, going to Lookout, having a perspective of downtown. From this vantage point, I still don't think there's a lot of folks in Chattanooga now who ever will have that perspective, or who just don't at this point. And so I want to make sure we brought that back up as we talk about how inclusive we is. I don't think the we includes the folks who can go up the mountain and then see this, or folks who have an opportunity to fly over and see it, but it's really the folks who live in it and never see it from that vantage point.
It can look beautiful, but I think it's also because we take the things that are important out of it, the things that are human out of it. I've also been sort of sitting here feeding myself and wondering, well, maybe the way we organize cities shows the problems that we have and it shows our character. Maybe having a highway like this that goes through two places, and maybe separating things like that, maybe separating things over here. Maybe the way we separate space and live in it defines who we are, so we can sort of get the smaller scale identity on a bigger scale. And I'm wondering what you guys think about that. You know, can you see a city's identity and how the individual citizens will view issues by looking at how they organize bigger space?
So how about it? Like, does where we choose to lay roads and highways tell us more about who we are as a people?
I think, thank you for bringing this up. I think it's actually really important if we think about Chattanooga, our history and then our future. I think our future, where we lay roads, will be more equitable. The decisions we make about where we put waste management facilities will be different, right? Because our past selves and the identity that was kind of dominated by one particular viewpoint would not have really given much thought to what communities were impacted, because those communities didn't matter. And so to your question, how do we develop, how do we plan a space does that speak to our identity? Certainly, I think it speaks to which identity prevails. Hopefully for the future of Chattanooga, I think we have where identities play a role, and I think those identities carry equal amount of weight and value.
Yeah.